Good morning. Biology 1302. We're going to talk about chapter 12 today, the forces of evolutionary change. Last time we talked about what evolution was. This time we're going to talk about the changes, the forces that actually cause evolution to occur. Okay, so why do we study evolution? We study evolution so we can understand the relationships between organisms, how things on planet Earth came to be the way they are today. If you think back, we talk about evolution. It does not occur at the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. We're not going to talk much about that, if at all. Evolution acts on populations. Within a group of interbreeding organisms, you can have all sorts of things that lead to evolution. We're going to talk about today migration, new genes coming into a population. We're going to talk about non-random mating. Non-random mating means that some organisms within a population are going to have more opportunities to mate or be better at getting their genes into the next generation. We're going to talk about genetic drift, what happens when a once thriving population is severely reduced and then allowed to repopulate or grow in numbers again. How can that affect the evolutionary process? We're going to talk about mutations. And then finally, we will talk about natural selection. All of these have to do with alleles. And if you remember from a previous chapter, alleles are different forms of a gene. You have an allele for blue eyes and an allele for brown eyes. The allele is the eye color is the trait. Different forms of that trait are the alleles. Evolution is nothing more than changing over time, changing allele frequencies over time. Eventually, it is possible that changes can lead to the development of a new species if enough heritable changes happen from generation to generation. In this very simplistic drawing, you have a historic plant that looks like this, that goes through a series of changes caused by a number of things, ultimately becoming this entirely new looking plant. Evolution occurs again at the population level. Individuals do not evolve because my alleles don't change. But the allele I pass on to an offspring could change through mutation or some other factor, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But allele frequencies do not change. You see, this gentleman has alleles for dark hair. This lady has alleles for light hair. So, in the populations of Asia, for instance, the allele frequency of dark hair is very large. The allele frequency is found by calculating the number of copies of the allele and dividing it by the number of alleles in the same population. So if let's just say there's 6 billion alleles, everybody gets 2, so there's 6 billion alleles total in Asia for hair color, and 5.99 billion of them are for dark hair or for black hair, then the allele frequency is going to be very high. However, if there is 5.99 billion black hair alleles, that means there's only going to be 0.001 million, which would be what? Would that be 1,000? Alleles for light hair. So the allele frequency of that would be very low. In the Scandinavian countries, in Sweden, where most of the people have blonde hair, the allele for blonde hair or for light colored hair is more or larger than the allele for dark hair or for black hair. If Swedish people were to migrate to Asia and then begin to interbreed with the Asian folks, the allele frequency in Asia would change. That population has evolved. That's all evolution is. Changing allele frequency over time. 5,000 years ago, very few blonde-haired alleles in Asia. And I'm relatively sure the number is significantly higher now, because it says if Swedish people migrate to Asia, I'm here to tell you, Swedish people have migrated to Asia. Asian peoples have migrated to Sweden. This is happening. Populations have evolved. Some of the early scientists who thought about this concept, you go all the way back to Aristotle. He said that individuals in a species were basically identical and species are unchanging. He said, you are what you are and we're always going to be that way. Some guy, very, very interestingly named, I'm sure it's not supposed to be pronounced buffoon, but that's what it looks like to me. That species change as they spread from their original location. In other words, if somebody moved from a hot climate to a cold climate, or from a cold to a hot, they would change. That new species arise from a common ancestor and all are changing. Then we have our buddy Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed the first scientifically testable evolutionary theory. He's the one who said from a previous chapter, he proposed the theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, and I told a little story about Arnold Schwarzenegger. Then we have Charles Lyell, who proposed that all changes that happen on Earth are gradual, and that very few of the features of the planet and evolutionary change does not happen quickly. It actually happens over, for an organism to change, it would happen over thousands of generations, not from one generation to the next. And then lastly, these last two gentlemen, there may be some more on the next slide. This is Charles Darwin. This is a gentleman by the name of Alfred Russel Wallace. They both proposed the same theory. Most textbooks say at the same time, and it really wasn't at the same time. Darwin actually came up with his theory about 15 to 20 years early, but he was counseled by some of his friends and colleagues that his idea was so out of the norm that he might not want to talk about it and publish it because the church might not like it very much. And so he sort of put it on a shelf and forgot about it. And then 15 or so years later, Wallace came up with his idea, actually sent his proposed thesis type paper to Darwin for Darwin to look at it. And Darwin said, hey, wait a minute, I wrote that 15 years ago. Darwin was looking at animals, larger animals. Wallace was looking at some plants and some insect type creatures. But again, the same idea at approximately the same time. Our discoveries of fossils has shown us through geologic time that when you have an area like the Grand Canyon that is layered like this, the farther you go down, the older the rock layers get. Older rock layers contain older fossils. You have to be careful with this, however, because again, there are places on planet Earth where these layers have been tilted or even folded over, so they're actually upside down from the way they were originally laid down. But in an area like the Grand Canyon, where you can look and see how this is made, farther down you go, the older rock layers appear. Since Charles Darwin had what was referred to as provenance for his idea of natural selection, he gets credit for being the discoverer of this, and Wallace is sort of left as a footnote to history. Darwin documented his findings. He was on a boat called the HMS Beagle, which left in 1831. It left London, came down the Atlantic, came down the coast of Africa over to South America, where it bounced along the coast of South America, made the circle down here at the whatever that is, what that southern tip of South America is called, Tierra del Fuego. Then he started up the coast of South America. They jumped over here to the Galapagos Islands, where he spent several weeks looking at the uniqueness of these islands. Then they shot out across the Pacific, bounced around, I believe that's New Zealand right there. Then he hopped over to Australia in a couple of points, went up into the Indian Ocean, came down, took a stop by Madagascar, the southern tip of Africa, came back over to, that's Brazil, I believe, and then went back to London in 1836. This was a 5-year voyage. I don't know whether that's where, if, again, I'll show my age, but I don't know how many of you are fans of the original Star Trek species or Star Trek TV series. But on that one at the beginning, Captain Kirk says that the Enterprise is on a 5-year mission. I don't know where this is where the writers got that idea, or they just pulled 5 years out of their hat. But I always like to put that into perspective. It was a 5-year journey. He had read an essay by a gentleman named Malthus, who Malthus said that human beings were could very quickly overpopulate the planet, and that war was actually beneficial because war was a way to limit the size of the human population. Humans start to overpopulate the planet, and we have a big war and kill off a bunch of us. And then the population starts to build back up, and we have another big war to kill off a bunch of them. He reasoned that that in any population, individuals cannot sustain essential resources, would die. And basically what Malthus was saying is the planet Earth has a carrying capacity that if you go beyond that, the planet won't be able to sustain it, and we'll all starve to death. And I don't remember, it's been a long time since I read Malthus, but the number he proposed was something like 1.5 million or something. It was an incredibly small number based on the population that we have on the planet today. Darwin studied the finches in Galapagos Islands. He also looked at other animals there. The thing he noticed about the finches was their beaks. He noticed that these animals, or these birds, had very different beak shapes. And their beak shape was designed especially for the food that they ate. And he noticed that these islands are right here. This is the coast of South America. What he discovered was that there's a group of finches right here that look absolutely nothing like the finches here. And what he reasoned was that at some point in history, a group of these finches, maybe a flock of finches in a storm, got blown over and landed on these Galapagos Islands. The finches probably could not fly from here to here under normal circumstances, but due to the wind currents and all of the storm, they were able to make it that far. But the finches could very easily travel between the group of islands that make up the Galapagos Islands. So his theory was that these finches would fly to an island. Some of them could eat the available food. The ones that couldn't would fly to another island, and they could eat the available food there because of slight differences in their beak shapes or something. And they literally spread themselves over the islands and radiated that way. And we'll talk about something called adaptive radiation here in a few minutes. And they were able to each one fill a niche. Some people pronounce that word niche. Again, I was taught niche. And on one island, they had one food source, and on another island, they had a different food source. He reasoned again that the survival and reproduction rate of the finches living on these islands would be for the one that was best suited to the environment. Again, if they could eat the available food efficiently, they were going to be more likely to reproduce than the birds that could not reproduce or could not eat that food as efficiently. Another example of the ways, evolution can occur is something called artificial selection. Now, natural selection means nature's doing the choosing. Artificial selection, on the other hand, means something else is happening. And most often in artificial selection is also sometimes called selective breeding. This gave Darwin the idea for natural selection as an evolutionary force. Artificial selection, we're doing something. This is a plant called wild mustard. Through artificial selection, human beings have done some really weird things with artificial mustard. First of all, with a certain set of crossbreedings, we produce something called broccoli. With another set of artificial manipulations, we produce something called Brussels sprouts. With another set of artificial selections, we produce something called cauliflower. Another set, we got kale. And another set, cabbage. All of these plants come from the same naturally occurring mustard plant. And human beings, the broccoli is the stems and the flowers. The Brussels sprouts are lateral buds. A lateral bud is a bud that occurs right there where the stem and the limb, if lack of a better term, grows. Flower clusters, again, these are individual stems from the little bitty flowers. We have flower clusters that actually occur down here. The Brussels sprouts, the leaves are the kale. So these, we manipulated the leaf production and we made kale. And then terminal buds, while the lateral bud is found right here, the terminal bud is found out there. And the terminal bud, again, through selective crossbreeding and artificial selection, we human beings, produce cabbage. All of these 5 different food products came from human beings manipulating a historic plant. Another way we artificially selected things was purebred dogs. Human beings have manipulated dogs for thousands of years, trying to breed in good qualities of the wolf and breed out bad qualities of the wolf. And, lots of folks love to have their purebred dogs. I am not a fan of purebred dogs. I don't dislike them. I love dogs. I've always had dogs. But I've always had what are referred to as mutts. I have dogs that are a combination of lots of different breeds. The dog I have right now looks very much like a Labrador Retriever, but he's not. I can look at him and I can look at his tail and say that's not the tail of a Labrador Retriever. I can look at his ears and say those are not the ears of a Labrador Retriever. I can look at his head and say that is not the head of a Labrador Retriever. But just on general outlook, he looks like a lab. He's not. He's a mutt, but I wouldn't take anything for him. But that's the kind of dogs I have. Now, one of the reasons I prefer mutts is most of these associated health problems that you see with all these purebreds don't occur in mutts. If you own a Cocker Spaniel, they're nervous. They have prone for ear infections. They have hernias and kidney problems. There's not a worse dog in the world to have if you have small children than a Cocker Spaniel. Now, if you love Cocker Spaniels, I'm sorry I'm talking bad about your dog. These things are bat crap crazy. Not all of them. Some of you have probably had a Cocker Spaniel and have never had a bad experience with him. And you were lucky, because these dogs, this nervousness tends to aggression and biting. Collies. Collies are known for blindness. They have bald spots and they often have seizure disorders. The Dalmatian. A large percentage of Dalmatian puppies are born deaf. German Shepherds, hip dysplasia. All you got to look at the way a German Shepherd's body is made, and you can say, that dog's going to have some hip problems in his life because of the way they're positioned, the way they're set. Now, we human beings bred that into them because what we wanted the German Shepherd to do, that was an advantageous body position, but it also leads to hip dysplasia. The Golden Retriever, lymphatic cancer, muscular dystrophy, skin allergies, hip dysplasia, absence of a testicle, very common in Golden Retrievers. The Great Dane, heart failures and bone cancer. The Lab, dwarfism and blindness. The Shar-Pei, skin disorders. All of these are purebred dogs, but these are all associated health issues that as we are breeding, as we are artificially selecting things, so the dog looked like this, these were unforeseen consequences of that artificial selection. And why don't they say anything about the dachshund? We've got a dachshund sitting right here in the picture, and we don't even talk about the dachshund. But Darwin proposed natural selection as a mechanism. The things he observed in nature, genetic variation. Within a species, there is variation. There are tall humans, there are short humans, there are brown-haired humans, there are blonde-haired humans. All of that is genetic variation. Limited resources. Suppose a human goes to live on an island and there's only one or two things to eat. Could that play a role? Let's say we put 10 males and 10 females on an island and they were very limited in their resources. How good would they be at surviving? Would it possibly be that some of those may have an advantage? Maybe there's plenty to eat, but it's really, really high in a tree and you got to be able to climb the tree. I'm not a tree climber. I probably wouldn't do too well unless one of the tree climbers would agree to give me some food. Overproduction of offspring. You go to another island where there's plenty to eat, it's readily available. You got 10 young folks or 20 young folks, and they've got a big old island. Pretty soon they overpopulate it, and they wind up eating all the food. Then what are you going to do? These are what he observed. The inferences. There is a struggle for existence. Individuals have to, there's an old saying about you got to look out for number one. So that's the struggle for existence. I want to pass my genes on to the next generation, but so does that fella and that fella and that fella. How well are we going to do that? That's the struggle. Unequal reproductive success. Whatever the case may be, one guy's better looking than the other one, so the girls gravitate toward him. One guy, is more physically fit, so he can beat up all the rest of them, and he gets to make the babies. So again, unequal reproductive success. And something called descent with modification. Simply what that means is, I'm not going to change, but my offspring might. My offspring might be taller than me. If we're living underground in caves and tunnels, my offspring might be shorter than me. Whatever is beneficial, common descent with modification. Here we pick up back with Charles Darwin and our little timeline we saw earlier. Again, both Darwin and Wallace laid the foundation. Here's Darwin in 1859. He published On Origin of Species. Then in 1865, Mendel discovered the basic laws of inheritance. Here's the thing about Mendel. He discovered all this stuff and talked about it a little bit, but again, he was a monk. Church wasn't real big on some of these ideas that he had, so he just sort of put it on the shelf and didn't talk about it. It wasn't rediscovered till the early 1900s. So only 120 years ago were the discoveries of Mendel rediscovered. Then in 1906, we discovered that there are decay rates in certain radioactive isotopes, C14 for instance. We learned that we could use that to determine how old things are. That's when we got the idea that the Earth wasn't only a few thousand years old, the Earth was actually several billions of years old. Lost my place, lost my train of thought. Then we've got a couple of gentlemen, Morgan and Sturtevant. Don't worry about them, I'm not going to ask you anything about them, but they are the ones that originally began to map chromosomes or genes on chromosomes. And again, using the fruit fly. The fruit fly is the animal that is almost always studied if you take a genetics lab. And then we have the modern evolutionary synthesis, which brings everything together, all of these varying ideas in the 1930s and 40s. Then we have Watson and Crick discovering the structure of DNA in 53. The theory of plate tectonics was put forth in the 1960s. Woest reclassified life into three domains: domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukaryae. Remember we talked about that in like chapter 1 or 3 or somewhere very early in the semester. 1995, we were doing large-scale gene sequencing that showed the relationships between species and what separated a species. This is some of the early work that really changed the minds of some people for years. The panda bear bounced back from being is it a bear or is it a great big raccoon? Is it a bear or is it a raccoon? Well, it was through DNA analysis in the early 90s that question was finally put to rest. The panda, giant panda, and the red panda are both bears. They are members of the bear family. And now we still have gene functions and gene regulation research that's going on to the present day and will continue into the future. The modern evolutionary synthesis, which began in the early 1970s, showed that heritable traits are passed on in our DNA. I have traits, my wife has traits, we made babies, and those babies have traits. DNA mutations and sexual reproduction are continuous sources of heritable variation. My DNA duplicates, there's a mutation that occurs, I pass that mutation on to my offspring, and guess what? The human genome has just evolved. Again, evolutionary theory is often misunderstood. Again, as I said when I talked about evolution in the last chapter, it is probably the most misunderstood and controversial subject that is discussed in a biology class. There are school districts in this state in primary education that will not allow, and again, no disrespect, but most of these are church-associated schools. I go to church. I'm a churchgoer. Don't get me wrong. But most of these are church-associated schools, and they will not allow their biology teachers to teach evolution because they don't believe in it. But it's misunderstood. Biological evolutionary explains the origin of life. Biological evolution did not begin until life existed. In other words, this is the misconception. Explains the origin of life. No, it didn't even begin until life existed. Another misconception, evolution is a random process. No, there are certain mechanisms that make evolution happen. Mutations, they don't occur randomly. They occur in a very orderly fashion. Natural selection, however, is non-random because the environment selects against poorly adapted individuals. So evolution is not a random process. And in a changing environment, all individuals in a population simultaneously develop beneficial adaptations. That is a misconception. Adaptations become fixed in a population over multiple generations. As individuals with those beneficial adaptations are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass their genes on to the next generation. The whole population does not evolve. A segment of the population evolves. And if that change is beneficial and the individuals with the change are more likely to survive and pass it on, and these over here are going to die, well, eventually the organism is going to change. But it's not all the individuals, it's a subset of the individuals. Now, natural selection. Natural selection, very important, does not create alleles. It simply shuffles the concentration or the number of alleles. This seahorse right here has the alleles for a particular phenotype. It allows it to blend into its surroundings. Very useful for evading predators. We've seen this little seahorse before in a previous chapter. But this guy right here has the alleles. And as he passes them on to his offspring, they will continue to have the alleles. Variation. Since there are more individuals born than resources can support, struggle to survive is inevitable. This is a picture of a dandelion. Almost all of us at some point in our life has picked up a dandelion and gone and made the little fluffy things fly all over the place. That is the way these seeds are dispersed. Now, nature did not create this so little kids can pick it up and go. Nature made it so the wind will do it. But same process. Now, all of these seeds are not going to grow new dandelions. Some of them will be eaten by insects. Some of them may be eaten by birds. All of them will not be ultimately growing dandelions. So, more resources, more individuals than the resources can support. So, The struggle is which one of these is going to actually be able to grow a new dandelion. Adaptations. These are heritable features that give an organism the ability to reproduce. For example, some people may produce more gametes than others. If you produce more gametes than others, and then the likelihood of those gametes getting together, you know, if one, again, not to be too graphic here, but if one man gives a lady, say, 10,000 gametes, and another gentleman gives another lady 10 million sperm, which one is more likely to reproduce? The guy that's producing the 10 million over there. More likely for those the one egg and one of those 10 million sperms to bump together in the right place at the right time, rather than one egg and one of 10. Antibiotics create natural selection for resistant bacteria. Again, here's my bacterial cell. Here's the bacteria cells here. Here's the bandage. You see, you're taking the bandage off. Some of the bacteria are staying on the skin. The original allele, you can see, looks like this. Over time, we have a mutation that occurs. The mutation occurs right there, and it makes this one individual cell red instead of green in this drawing. Then when those cells start to reproduce, this one's going to reproduce and produce a whole bunch of these. These are going to reproduce and produce a whole bunch of these, but only a few of these. But what can happen when we introduce an antibiotic into the case, the antibiotic is getting rid of all of these, so you see very few of them up here, but it's not getting rid of these, and you see the red ones are starting to grow. With the antibiotic absent, you still see the normal concentration. Most cells have the original, most cells have the new allele. And again, this doesn't just happen in one generation, multiple generations later. The thing about bacteria is that multiple generations can occur very quickly. To produce 4 or 5 generations of humans takes 100 years. To produce 4 or 5 generations of bacteria takes an hour, if that. Again, same molecule, same drawing. Antibiotics cannot create a resistant allele. The variation in resistance was already present in the population. That's what's very important to understand about antibiotic resistance. The presence of the antibiotic is not causing the resistance. The presence of the antibiotic may be changing the allele frequency within the population. Natural selection can also eliminate poorly adapted phenotypes. Here are the nice little sea turtles. The mama sea turtle crawls up on the beach, and she goes far enough up the beach to avoid the tide line. She then digs a hole, drops in her 50 to 100 or 200 eggs, however many eggs they make. And then after a certain amount of time, those little baby turtles go dig their way out of the nest. They hatch, they dig their way out of the nest, and they crawl down to the beach. There's the edge of the beach right there. And you see they've got the long front flippers and the short back flippers. These are used primarily for propulsion. These back here are used for steering. And once these little guys hit the ocean and start swimming, the only time they come out of the ocean is if they're females and if they're coming out of the ocean to lay eggs. The rest of the time, they spend in the water. So if there happens to be a phenotypic change where these fins, or they're actually legs, but the way they're made to look like flippers. If they're really, really short in a phenotype, that animal's probably not going to survive. It's not going to be able to swim well enough to stay away from predators, maybe not even swim well enough to gather the food. These things eat jellyfish and other things like that, but it may not be able to swim well enough to even, get its food. So that would be an example of a poor phenotype that simply would not survive. Therefore, that phenotype wouldn't get passed on to offspring. This is a fossilized animal. Let's see, natural selection can eliminate an entire species. Let's say, for instance, this is some kind of creature that needed the ocean water to be 74 degrees, at least 74 degrees. Could stand to be warmer, could not stand to be colder, and there was a global climate change to where the temperature of the oceans went from 74 degrees to 54 degrees. Then that organism and those alleles for, what would it be? Endothermic reactions or heat control weren't there. The whole entire organism could go extinct. You also could have, this is fossilized wood. This is actually a tree trunk that had over millions of years has been turned into stone through a process that takes geology, and you can learn about that process. But again, the species, it may have had something to do with maybe the temperature, maybe the moisture levels went down or went up, and this tree could not support that change in moisture level. Very important to understand that evolution does not have a goal. There's not a goal for this. This is something that happens. The orchid and its wasp pollinator have evolved alongside one another. Here's the wasp. Here's the orchid. And this wasp has a really long tongue, sticks its tongue all the way down to here, where it gets the nectar from this particular flower. In doing so, it's pollinating the flower. It gets the pollen, which is up here on its head. Then it goes to another flower, and when it sticks its head in there, it puts the pollen onto these little stigmas right here, and the plant gets pollinated, and the wasp also. And as this plant evolved to make this bud longer and longer and longer, the longer-tongued wasps also were able to survive, while shorter-tongued wasps were not able to survive. The wasp created what is referred to as a selective advantage for orchids with the right shape of wasp. Fitness. How good are you at turning your generation or your genes into the next generation? Survival is not enough for evolutionary fitness. You can't just survive. You have to reproduce. If you are a human being and you have a whole bunch of really cool genes and you never have a baby, you don't put those genes into the next generation. So it's more than just survival. Fitness depends on the ability to reproduce. What you want to do is get your genes into the next generation. You want to ultimately get copies of your genes, as many copies of your genes as possible, into the next generation. That is your evolutionary fitness. I'm going to stop right here so this video won't be too long, and I will pick back up in a few minutes and make a part 2. Thank you.